When a woman has lost everything, her husband, her home, and her good name, what's the one thing that can bring her back from the edge? In the unforgiving frontier, it's not strength. It's not money. It's a small, silent, barefoot boy who shows up at her cabin in the middle of a deadly storm, with the entire town ready to cast them both out. Welcome to Frontier Rescue Stories. Before we jump into this incredible tale, I need your help. If you believe in the power of second chances and that family is more than just blood, please help me build this community. Go ahead and hit that like button. Share this story with someone who needs it. And most importantly, subscribe and ring that bell. Let's create some hype and get these stories of resilience to a larger audience that needs to hear them. Your support means everything. Oh, and one more thing. I'd love to know where you're listening from. Let me know in the comments what part of the world you are in. Okay, settle in. Let's begin. Our story begins not with a gunshot, but with a whisper. And that whisper had a name. Ilara Vance. Ilara was a widow, though the term felt too simple, too small, for the vast, hollow space in her chest. She had arrived in the town of Stone Creek on the back of a mud-splattered stagecoach, with 2 canvas trunks, a threadbare coat, and a name that wasn't entirely her own. Or rather, the name was hers, but the rumors that preceded it, whispered from one outpost to the next, were a fiction. The rumors claimed she was a wealthy widow, that her late husband had struck silver and left her a fortune. The rumors were, of course, a cruel lie. Her husband had left her nothing but a tarnished silver locket that hung cold against her skin, a locket she hadn't found the strength to open in 6 long months, and a deep, abiding silence. Stone Creek was not a town that welcomed silence. It was a place built on noise, the sharp ring of hammers on steel, the braying of mules, the constant scraping wind that scoured the single dusty street, and above all, the noise of talk. And when Ilara Vance used the last of her real money to buy the derelict cabin on the edge of town, the one left to rot after the last blizzard claimed its owners, the talk intensified. Too good for the town inn, is she? They'd say over watered-down whiskey. Puts on airs, Mrs. Agatha Blackwood, the deacon's wife and the town's self-appointed moral compass, had pronounced. And in a town like Stone Creek, when Mrs. Blackwood passed judgment, the gavel had fallen. Ilara didn't mind. She wanted the isolation. The cabin was a wreck, its bones picked clean by wind and time. But the wind didn't judge. The dust didn't gossip. She spent her first week in a frantic flurry of work. She patched the holes in the roof with scavenged tin. She stuffed rags, old newspaper, and dried moss into the gaps between the log walls. She scrubbed the floorboards until her knuckles were raw, trying to erase the memory of the life that had brought her to this precipice. She was alone, and that, she felt, was a fortress. But Stone Creek had a way of laying siege to any fortress. It was on the 4th day, as she was on her knees, trying to wrestle a stubborn, broken shutter back onto its leather hinges, that she felt it. The unmistakable prickle on the back of her neck. That primal, ancient feeling of being watched. She spun around, a rusty nail clutched in her hand. There was nothing. Just the gray sagebrush, the sharp-edged granite rocks, and the endless, oppressive blue of the sky. She shook her head, blaming the altitude, the hunger, the grief that played tricks on the mind. She went back to the shutter, and there it was again. Undeniable. She stood up slowly this time. She shielded her eyes and scanned the low ridge of granite that overlooked her small, wind-blasted plot of land. And she saw him. Or she saw it at first, just a smudge of movement, a patch of gray on gray. She squinted. It was a boy. He couldn't have been more than 7, maybe 8 years old. He was dressed in rags that seemed to be the same color as the dirt, and even from this distance, she could see he was barefoot, his small feet planted on the sharp stones as if he were a part of them. He was unnervingly still, not like a child but like a hawk. He just watched. Ilara's heart, which she thought had turned to stone, gave a strange, painful kick. She raised a hand, a hesitant small wave. The boy didn't move. He didn't wave back. He didn't run. He just watched. The wind picked up, pulling at her hair, and when she brushed the strands from her face, she looked back at the ridge. He was gone. He hadn't run. He had simply vanished, as if the wind itself had taken him. She was left with only the sound of the wind and the deeply unsettling feeling that her fortress, her one place of solitude, had just been breached. She told herself it was a mirage. a trick of the light and her own profound loneliness. But that night, as she sat by her small, smoky fire, she found she had bolted the door, a door that had no lock just yesterday. She clutched the locket at her throat, the cold silver a familiar, painful anchor. The whispers of the town were one thing. They were words. But the silence of that boy, that was something else entirely. It felt like a mirror. She didn't see him for 2 more days. The town continued its Cold War. The general store owner, Mr. Henderson, who had greeted her with a calculating smile, suddenly found his prices higher for her. The children who played marbles in the street would stop their games and stare as she passed, their mothers pulling them close as if Ilara's grief were a disease. She was an outsider, a mystery they couldn't solve, and therefore a threat. She was in the process of building a life, but she felt more like a ghost, haunting the edges of her own existence. She was so focused on the town in front of her, she had almost forgotten about the ridge behind her. Almost. The feeling of those silent, watching eyes never quite left her. She was a woman surrounded by silence, the town's judgment, her own grief, and the watching, waiting wilderness. She didn't know it yet, but the wilderness was about to knock on her door. He was gone a moment later, but the feeling of being watched remained, clinging to Ilara like the dust. That night the wind stopped its howling, and the sky, in a fit of cruel irony, opened up. A cold, driving autumn rain began to fall, turning the dust of Stone Creek into a thick, greedy mud. Ilara's cabin, for all her hard work, was not ready. Water found its way through the chinks in the roof, and a steady drip, drip, drip into a tin pot became the maddening rhythm of her night. She was cold, she was damp, and she was so very tired of fighting. She was huddled in her only dry blanket, staring into the weak, sputtering flames of her fire, when she heard it. It wasn't the rain. It wasn't the wind. It was a sound so small, so pathetic she almost missed it. A soft scratching at her door. Like a small branch or a bird. She froze. The town marshal was miles away. The nearest ranch was even further. No one came to this cabin, especially not in a storm like this in the dead of night. She clutched the heavy iron poker from the fireplace, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Who's there?" She called out, her voice sounding thin and weak, immediately snatched away by the wind. The scratching stopped. Only the sound of the rain remained, lashing against the thin glass. She let out a shaky breath. It was just a branch. She was letting the town's suspicion make her jumpy, make her see ghosts in the daylight and hear phantoms in the night. She turned back to the fire. Scratch, scratch, scratch. This time it was more insistent. And it was followed by a sound that broke her heart. A small, desperate human cough, choked off immediately, as if in fear. Ilara dropped the poker. It clattered loudly on the stone hearth. She lunged for the door, her own fear evaporating, replaced by a sudden, fierce urgency. She unbarred the door and pulled it open. The wind tore it from her grasp, slamming it against the inside wall. And there, framed in the dark, chaotic night, was the boy from the ridge. He was soaked to the bone, his thin rags clinging to a body that was little more than sharp angles and bird-like bones. His hair was plastered to his skull, and his face was smeared with mud, but his eyes were the same, wide, dark, and impossibly old. He was shaking, not with fear, but with a deep, violent chill. He didn't look at her. He was staring past her, at the small, smoky fire. My God. Ilara breathed. She didn't think. She reached out, grabbed his thin, icy arm and pulled him inside, using all her strength to slam the door shut against the storm. The boy stumbled, almost falling, but he didn't make a sound. Not a cry, not a whimper. He just stood there, dripping on her floor, his arms wrapped around his own tiny chest. And then she saw it. Around his waist, over his wet rags, was a small, worn leather tool belt. It was cracked and old, and from its loops hung a few pathetic items. A bent nail, a piece of string, and the wooden handle of a long-lost hammer. "You're freezing," she said, her voice rough. She threw her one dry blanket over his shoulders. He flinched at the contact, but didn't pull away. He just stared at the fire, a pilgrim who had finally reached his shrine. She bustled around him, her previous lethargy gone. She poured the last of her hot water from the kettle into a mug, stirring in a precious spoonful of sugar. She knelt in front of him. "Here, drink." He wouldn't take it. He wouldn't even look at her. His gaze was fixed on the flames. "Please," she whispered. "It's warm." He turned his head then, just slightly. He looked at the mug. He looked at her face. And then, very slowly, he raised a muddy hand and pointed. Not at the mug. Not at the fire. He pointed at her. Then he pointed to his own chest. Ilara frowned. What is it? I don't understand. He pointed at her again. Then at himself. And then he pointed to the floor, to the small braided rag rug she had placed by the hearth. He tapped the rug twice. He looked up at her, his eyes clear and desperate, and he whispered a single word, his voice a dry, rasping sound, like dry leaves skittering over stone. Home, he said. Ilara's breath caught in her throat. He wasn't asking for shelter. He was stating it. He was lost, a stray, an orphan. And he had just named her cabin, this broken-down, leaking shack, home. Before she could reply, before she could even process the weight of that one word, there was another, more forceful knock on the door. This one was not a scratch. This was a pounding. Ilara's blood ran cold. She stood up, shielding the boy. Who is it? She yelled over the storm. Mrs. Vance, open this door. I know you're in there. The voice was sharp, brittle, and instantly recognizable. Mrs. Agatha Blackwood. Ilara glanced at the boy who had curled into a tight ball, his eyes wide with a terror that hadn't been there for the storm. With a heavy sigh, Ilara went to the door and opened it. Mrs. Blackwood stood on her doorstep, lantern held high, her face a mask of stern disapproval. I saw your light, she began. Then her eyes darted past Ilara to the small, trembling form by the fire. Her lips thinned into a razor line. So, she said, her voice dripping with ice. The rumors are true. You are collecting strays, Mrs. Vance. The echo of Mrs. Blackwood's judgment hung in the damp air long after she'd left. She had given Ilara a warning, not a threat. The good people of Stone Creek do not approve of vagrancy, she had said, her eyes fixed on the boy, who watched her with his silent, old eyes. The county orphanage is where he belongs. See that he gets there. And then she was gone, a righteous ghost swallowed by the storm. Ilara had closed the door, her hands shaking with a rage she hadn't felt in months. She turned to the boy. He was still by the fire, but he had picked up the iron poker, holding it like a tiny, defiant soldier. Ilara slowly knelt, her hands open. She's gone, she said softly. You're safe. The boy watched her for a long moment. Then, very slowly, he let the poker clatter to the stone. She never did take him to the orphanage. She couldn't. The next morning she asked him his name. He just shook his head. She asked him where he came from. He pointed to the ridge. She asked him about his family. He just tapped the worn leather tool belt at his waist. That, it seemed, was the only answer he had. She tried calling him boy, but it felt wrong, like calling a bird creature. She remembered her father's garden, how he would put small, dried peas, pips, in her hand to plant. Something small, he'd said, his voice thick with an Irish lilt, that holds a whole future. She looked at the boy, small and silent, holding his own unknown future. Pip, she said. I'm going to call you Pip, is that all right? He gave the smallest, almost imperceptible nod. And so, Pip he was. A routine formed, the way water carves a new path. It was a routine of silence. They became a makeshift family, built not on blood or a shared name, but on a shared need to survive. They were two quiet, broken things, living in the shadow of a town that despised them both. Ilara would work on the cabin, and Pip, wordlessly, would work alongside her. He was, it turned out, astonishingly useful. His little tool belt wasn't a toy. He seemed to understand the language of broken things. When a hinge squeaked, he found a bit of lard to silence it. When a floorboard warped, he'd find the perfect stone to wedge under it. He was a mender. Ilara felt herself mending too. The hollowness in her chest began to feel less empty. It was still there, but now there was something else. A purpose. She found herself talking to him, filling the silence. She'd tell him about the sea, which he'd never seen. She'd describe the colors of her mother's garden. He would just listen, his dark eyes fixed on her, absorbing every word. One afternoon, as she was kneading dough, her hands covered in flour, he pointed. His small, grime-covered finger hovered just above the silver locket at her throat. What is it? He whispered. It was the first word he'd spoken since home. Ilara's hands stilled in the dough. It's from before, she said, the words catching. It was my husband's. Pip tilted his head, a gesture of pure, childlike curiosity. Open it, he whispered again. Ilara's hand flew to her throat, her fingers closing around the locket. I can't, she said, the words strangled. She hadn't opened it since the funeral. She was afraid that if she did, the last wisp of her old life would fly out, and she would truly be empty. Pip watched her, his expression unreadable. He didn't push. He just nodded as if he understood. He understood the dignity and loss it represented. The town, however, was not so understanding. Their fragile peace was built on borrowed time. Mrs. Blackwood's warning had become the town's policy. When Alara went to the general store, Mr. Henderson, who had once been polite, now refused her. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Vance," he said, not sounding sorry at all. "I'm afraid I can't extend any more credit. Times are tight." Alara knew what he meant. The town was squeezing her out. She had barely enough money for flour, let alone the new axe handle she desperately needed. She returned to the cabin defeated, the weight of their isolation crushing her. She sat at her small, rickety table, her head in her hands. She had failed. She had failed her husband, and now she was failing this boy. She had rescued him from the storm, but she couldn't rescue him from the cold, hard judgment of Stone Creek. It was over. She would have to take him to the orphanage. She would have to surrender. She was so lost in her own despair she didn't notice Pip until he stood beside her. He was holding something. It was her broken axe, the head split clean from the handle. She'd left it by the woodpile, a symbol of her failure. Pip laid it on the table. Then, from his magical tool belt, he pulled a roll of waxed string and a small, sharp piece of flint. He sat down. He didn't say a word. He just began to work. His small hands moved with a certainty that was mesmerizing. He scraped. He wound. He tested. He worked for over an hour, his brow furrowed in concentration. Alara just watched him, her despair slowly, painstakingly, turning into something else. Awe. Finally, he stood up. He held out the axe. The handle was ugly, scarred and bound with string, but it was strong. He had mended it. He had taken what was broken and made it whole. He had shown his loyalty in the only way he knew how. He wasn't a burden. He was her partner. Alara looked from the axe to the boy and back. The tears that came were not tears of grief. They were tears of certainty. She would not let them be broken. But that fragile moment of peace, that certainty forged in a mended axe handle, was not meant to last. The town had one more card to play. A week later, as Alara and Pip were tending to a small, stubborn patch of ground they hoped would become a garden, a shadow fell over them. It was Mrs. Agatha Blackwood, and this time she was not alone. Beside her stood the town marshal, a big, weary man named Silas, whose badge seemed to be as heavy as his conscience. "Mrs. Vance," Mrs. Agatha Blackwood said, her voice clipped and final. "This has gone on long enough." Alara stood up slowly, wiping her hands on her apron. She moved almost instinctively, placing herself between the visitors and Pip, who had shrunk behind her, his hand gripping the back of her skirt. "Mrs. Blackwood, Marshal," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "To what do we owe the honor?" "There's no need for sarcasm, Mrs. Vance," Mrs. Blackwood snapped. "This is an official matter. We are here on behalf of the good people of Stone Creek, and by the authority of the county, to take the boy." Alara's blood turned to ice. "Take him?" she repeated. "Take him where?" "To the state orphanage in Denver," the marshal said, his voice a low rumble. He wouldn't meet her eyes. "He needs to be processed, Mrs. Vance. He needs a proper home, education. He can't stay here." The way he said here made it sound like a curse. "This is his home," Alara said, her voice low and fierce. "It is a shack, madam," Mrs. Blackwood interjected. "And you are?" "An unsuitable guardian. A woman of questionable means, with no husband, living on the edge of town. It is not decent. The boy is a vagrant, and you are enabling him." "He is not a vagrant," Alara said, her hands clenching into fists. "He is a child. He is a problem," Mrs. Blackwood countered, "and we are here to solve it." "Marshal, do your duty." The marshal took a step forward, his hand resting on his belt. "Ma'am, please don't make this difficult." Pip let out a small, terrified sound, like a trapped animal. That sound broke through Alara's fear and crystallized it into pure, unadulterated resolve. "No," she said, "just—" "No." The marshal stopped. "Ma'am?" "I said no. You will not take him. You have no right." "I have every right," Mrs. Blackwood said, her face flushing with anger. "We have a court order." "Then you will have to use it," Alara said, bracing herself. But you will not take him today. The marshal looked at Alara's face, at the small, terrified boy hiding behind her, and then at Mrs. Blackwood's furious expression. He sighed, a long, weary sound. Agatha, maybe we should discuss this on Sunday, at the chapel. Let the town council decide. Mrs. Blackwood looked like she wanted to argue, but then a slow, calculating smile spread across her face. A public forum. Her territory. She knew she would win there. Very well, Marshal. Sunday, then. We shall put the matter to the town. Let's see if your conviction holds up in the house of God, Mrs. Vance. She turned, her skirts swirling, and marched away, the marshal trailing reluctantly behind her. Sunday came, as Sundays do, cold and bright. The chapel was packed. Every seat was full. Alara and Pip sat in the back row, a small island in a sea of suspicion. Mrs. Blackwood sat in the front, a pillar of righteousness. After the hymns, the pastor, a nervous, mousy man, cleared his throat. And now, he said, Mrs. Blackwood has a civic matter to discuss. Agatha Blackwood stood. She faced the congregation, not the pastor. She was in her element. She spoke of moral hygiene. She spoke of Christian duty. She spoke of protecting the innocent. All the while her eyes were fixed on Alara. She spoke of wayward women and community standards. She painted a picture of Alara as a corrupting force and Pip as a disease that needed to be cleansed. The town of Stone Creek, she concluded, her voice ringing with authority, must decide. Do we stand for decency, or do we allow this rot to fester on our borders? I say we send the boy to Denver, where he belongs, and we pray for Mrs. Vance's soul. A heavy, awful silence fell, the silence of a judgmental town. Everyone looked at Alara. This was it, the moment of her surrender. The marshal was already moving to the back row. Alara felt Pip's hand, cold and small, slip into hers. She looked at his face. He was terrified, but he was looking at her with a look of absolute, unwavering trust. That trust was a steel rod in her spine. She squeezed his hand, and then she stood up. Her legs were shaking. Her voice, when it came, was quiet, but in that silent chapel, it cut through the air like a blade. Mrs. Blackwood, she began. The whole room held its breath. You speak of duty. You speak of decency, but you do not know the meaning of the words. A gasp went through the crowd. You talk of orphans, but you would make one. You want to send him to Denver? Do you know what that is? It's a brick building, Mrs. Blackwood. A cold, hard place where they will scrub the name Pip from him and give him a number. Where they will beat the spirit out of him until he is as silent and empty as you think he is. She took a step into the aisle, pulling Pip with her. You see a stray, a vagrant. I see a survivor. I see a boy who knows how to mend things. He mended my axe. He mended my roof. He is mending me. Her voice cracked, but she didn't stop. You see a shack. We see a home. You talk of my questionable means. My means are my 2 hands, the same as any of yours. And you talk of love, she said, her eyes finding Mrs. Blackwood's. You talk of God's love, but you would tear a family apart, because that is what we are. You say we are not blood? You are right. We are not. We are chosen. We are a family built on loyalty, on a cold night, and a storm, and a mended axe handle. And if that is not decent enough for Stone Creek, then I pity Stone Creek, she finished. The chapel was absolutely, devastatingly silent. In the ringing silence that followed Alara's words, no one moved. The air was thick, heavy with unspoken thoughts. Mrs. Blackwood's face, which had been a mask of triumph, was now pale with fury, her mouth opening and closing with no sound coming out. She had been defeated, not by an argument, but by a human truth. The townspeople didn't look at her. They looked at Alara and at the small boy who stood beside her, his hand clutching hers. And for the first time they saw them. They saw not a stray and a widow, but 2 people holding on. The marshal, who had been frozen in the aisle, was the first to move. He cleared his throat, the sound echoing in the chapel. He walked not to Alara, but back to the front. He looked at the pastor, then at Mrs. Blackwood, and then at the congregation. Well, he said, his voice quiet but firm, it seems to me there is no civic matter here. He turned and looked directly at Alara, and for the first time he met her eyes. He gave her a slow, respectful nod. Mrs. Vance, he said, and that was all. It was an apology. It was an acceptance. People began to murmur. They stood not all at once, but in small, shamefaced groups. They filed out of the chapel, pointedly not looking at Mrs. Blackwood. They did look at Alara, some with grudging respect, some with a new dawning kindness. Mr. Henderson, the store owner, paused as he passed her. He tipped his hat. "Mrs. Vance," he mumbled, his face red, I believe I have a new shipment of axe handles coming in tomorrow. First one is on the house." Alara was too stunned to speak. She just nodded. One by one they left, until the only people remaining in the chapel were Alara, Pip, and a seething, defeated Agatha Blackwood. Alara looked at her one last time with no triumph, only a deep, weary sadness. Then she turned. "Come on, Pip," she said softly. "Let's go home." The walk back to the cabin was different. The wind was still cold, but it didn't feel as biting. The street, which had always felt like a gauntlet of judging eyes, now seemed just like a street. And then something small and white drifted past Alara's face. She stopped. She looked up. A second larger flake landed on her sleeve. And then another. And another. The first snowfall of the season. Pip, who had been walking with his head down, looked up. His eyes went wide. He had never seen snow. He let go of Alara's hand and tilted his head back, his mouth open, letting the flakes land on his face. A small, strange sound came from his throat. It was a laugh. A real, rusty, beautiful laugh. Alara watched him, and the last of the ice around her own heart finally, truly, began to melt. That night the world was transformed. The worn cabin was covered in a thick, clean blanket of white. The sharp rocks and the gray sagebrush were gone, softened and made beautiful. Inside, for the first time, the cabin was truly warm. The fire roared in the hearth. A pot of thick stew, made with a cut of beef Mr. Henderson had also given her, bubbled, filling the small room with a rich, welcoming smell. Pip was asleep on the rag rug, his face peaceful in the firelight, his small tool belt still fastened at his waist. Alara sat at the table watching him. She was happy. The feeling was so foreign she almost didn't recognize it. After a long time, her hand went to her throat. She touched the silver locket. It felt different, not cold and heavy, but just there. Slowly, she unfastened the chain. She held the locket in the palm of her hand, the silver glowing in the firelight. Her fingers, which had trembled at the thought, were now steady. She found the small catch. She opened it. Inside was a tiny, faded tintype, a handsome man with a serious face. Her husband. She looked at his image for a long time, a single tear tracking a clean path through the soot on her cheek. She didn't cry for the loss. She cried for the memory. "Thank you," she whispered to the picture. "Thank you for bringing me here." Then she did something she hadn't known she was going to do. She closed the locket. She didn't remove the picture. That was still her past. But she opened a small wooden box where she kept her few treasures, her mother's thimble, a single button, and a small charcoal sketch Pip had drawn of a wobbly, three-legged chair. She carefully folded the sketch and tucked it into the locket, right next to the tintype. It was no longer an empty locket. It was no longer a shrine to her past. It was a new story, written on top of the old one. She fastened the chain back around her neck. She looked at the sleeping boy, then at the snow falling silently outside the window. The love story of Alara and Pip was sealed. Not with passion, but with something stronger. Resilience, hope, and the quiet, unshakable certainty of home. And that's the story of the widow and the sparrow of Stone Creek. Thank you so much for spending your time with us at Frontier Rescue Stories. If you enjoyed this journey, if you felt that moment of warmth in the cabin, please let us know by hitting that like button. It truly helps our community grow, and if you haven't already, please subscribe and share this story with someone who you think might need to hear it. We have a whole playlist of stories just like this one, tales of survival, resilience, and the unexpected families formed on the frontier. Be sure to check that out next. But now I want to hear from you. What did you think of Alara's speech in the chapel? And what part of the story resonated with you the most? Let me know in the comments below. Your feedback and your own stories are what inspire this channel. Also, if you have suggestions for a type of story you'd like to hear, please share those as well. We're always listening. From all of us here at Frontier Rescue Stories, we want to thank you for watching. Be kind to each other, be well, and we'll see you in the next story.